Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's 1 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today for our event, Our Take, Inclusion Canada's Positions on Income Security for Individuals and Families. Before we begin, we would like to run through some housekeeping and accessibility items with you. Today's event will be 1 hour long, with approximately 40 minutes of presentation and 20 minutes for questions and answers. This event will be presented in English. French simultaneous interpretation, ASL, LSQ, and English and French cart captioning is also provided. To turn on English or French cart captioning, please click the link in the chat box. The cart captions will appear in a new window. Using the toolbar along the bottom of the window, you can adjust the caption size, font style, and color. You can, my apologies. You can also change the background color. In the upper left, you can switch back and forth between English and French cart captioning. To turn on French simultaneous interpretation, please go to the toolbar along the bottom of your screen and click the arrow next to the interpretation button. An options menu will appear. Click French. You will now be able to hear the French interpreter, as well as the original audio at a much lower level. If you prefer to remove the English audio, click the interpretation button again and select Mute Original Audio. You will now hear the French interpreter only. Pour obtenir l'interprétation simultanée en français, cliquez sur la flèche située près de la touche Interprétation sur la barre d'outils au bas de l'écran, puis cliquez sur Français, French. Sur le menu qui apparaîtra à l'écran, vous pourrez désormais entendre l'interprète français ainsi que l'audio initial qui aura un plus faible volume. Si vous préférez supprimer le son de l'audio initial en anglais, cliquez à nouveau sur la touche Interprétation et choisissez Couper le son de l'audio d'origine, Mute Original Audio. À présent, vous n'entendrez plus que l'interprète en français. We are also pleased to have American Sign Language, ASL, and Langue des Signes du Québec, LSQ interpreters with us today. ASL and LSQ interpreters have been spotlighted, which means they will be visible on your screen at all times. There will be a question and answer at the end of the event. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We understand the Q&A box may not be an accessible format for everyone, so questions can also be submitted by email to forum@inclusioncanada.ca. Because of the large number of people participating in today's webinar, it may not be possible to respond to all questions. If you have technical difficulties, please let us know by email at forum@inclusioncanada.ca, and we will do our best to help you resolve them. To avoid common issues, please make sure you are watching the webinar from a location with a strong internet connection and that your computer's volume is turned on. We would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit and First Nations people and the chosen home of the Métis.
Hello and welcome to Inclusion Canada's webinar series, Our Take. My name is Krista Carr and I'm the Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada. Inclusion Canada is a national federation of 13 provincial territorial associations and over 300 local associations working to advance the full inclusion and human rights of people of an intellectual disability and their families. Today's event is the second in a three-part series exploring Inclusion Canada's recently updated position statements. Today's webinar will explore Inclusion Canada's position on income security for individuals and for families. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new attention to the issue of financial insecurity in Canada. Many people experienced for the first time what it means to be faced with rising costs and limited income. The issue of poverty is not new to people of an intellectual disability and their families. In fact, most income support programs for people with disabilities provide less than half the monthly amount that the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, did. Thank you for being with us here today as we explore the current realities and how to ensure people with an intellectual disability and their families have the income they need for a good quality life.
It's now my pleasure to introduce your hosts for the day. My name is Rachel Mills. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with Inclusion Canada, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. With me here today, we have Barb McIntyre. Barb is a parent. She is current Treasurer of Inclusion Canada and past President of Inclusion Alberta. Robert Smith is a self-advocate and council member with Community Living Ontario. And Jill Teeple is a current Director at Large on Inclusion Canada's board and is also chairperson of Inclusion Canada's Income Security Advisory Committee. So a big thank you to all of our panelists for being here with us today. And to begin our presentation, I'd like to pass it over to Robert, who's going to tell us a little bit about the current financial realities faced by adults with an intellectual disability in Canada. Robert, floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Smith. So I'm going to start off with people with a disability in Canada will probably end up poor. They do not have the disability supports they need. Almost 19% of people with an intellectual disabilities need better housing. They do not have jobs. They do not get enough income support. This means they often live in poverty. The poverty rate of people with intellectual disabilities who live on their own is 73%. They are also isolated. They are left out of society. Financial programs that help people are hard to use. They are confusing. They do not always help the people who need it. They can be hard for people who have no family to help them. They can be hard for people who do not understand money and numbers. COVID-19 made things worse. It is hard to be a person with a disability during COVID-19. Some cannot afford to live. The pandemic showed how unfair things are for people with disabilities. During COVID-19, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit was provided. The amount of this benefit was 50% more than most people in Canada get each month from their disability benefits. Can you imagine living on that? During COVID-19, some jobs were affected more than others. Many lower wage jobs were lost or hours were cut back. This affected people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They were more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic. They were also most likely to have their hours cut. This pushed people further into poverty. People with an intellectual disability only make about 33% of what people without disabilities make. That works out to 16,000 compared to 49,000. During COVID-19, people had to use the internet and cell phones more. Many services moved online. This was good in some ways. It helped to keep people connected, but many people with disabilities could not afford the increase in cost. It showed how this cost can exclude people. Some people with disabilities can't even afford to have internet at home. There is not enough information about people with intellectual disabilities. We do not know how many people in Canada have intellectual or developmental disabilities. Statistics Canada finds it hard to get a correct number. They usually estimate a number. It is usually lower than the real number. We need to know better information about people with intellectual disabilities, like how many people can have an intellectual or developmental disability? What is their quality of life? How much money do they make? And what are their poverty rates? People with intellectual disabilities need income security. This is about more than just money. It is also about lack of opportunity. It is about not having a choice. Some people have to choose between buying food or paying bills. Sometimes they have to ask doctors for free medicine samples. This is because they are poor. Poverty takes away people's dignity. There are many reasons that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are poor or at risk of living in poverty. Making education inclusive is important. A major reason why people with intellectual disabilities can't get jobs because they don't have a good education. There are many issues with education. Here are a couple of examples. Students with disabilities are separated from others. They're put in special education classrooms. They're isolated from the rest of the school. They don't learn the same information as other students. This sort of education will not help them get good jobs as adults. They are more likely to be unemployed. They are more likely to be left out of society. Very few adults with intellectual disability can get more education after high school. When they go to university or college or get training, they have a better chance at getting a job. One study showed that 80% of people who had education after high school got a job when they finished their studies. People with disabilities are also kept out of the job market. In our last webinar, we talked about many barriers to inclusive employment. Because of these barriers, people with disabilities have to rely too much on social assistance in Canada. Social assistance is supposed to be a last resort. It was not made to be long-term support. Across Canada, social assistance levels are too low. In every province and territory, social assistance amounts are below the poverty line. This means the programs do not give enough money to pay for basic needs like housing and food. These programs are also affected when people get jobs. Some programs take away income support when people get a job. People with disabilities are treated unfairly for trying to make their lives better. Some governments even took back the COVID disability benefit money from people on income support. Provinces and territories also provide other kinds of support like the disability support and health benefits. Many of these are linked to income support. The federal government has some programs too. Some supports programs conflict with each other. One support program should not affect another. The federal government has several programs to support people with disabilities, but many of them are too hard to access. The online system for filing taxes is very hard to figure out. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities can have a hard time using it. For many people, their disability benefits are the only income they have to report. This could be fixed. There could be an automatic tax filing for people with low income. The federal government already has this information. This would help many people. It would help make sure they do not miss out on any available benefits. This includes the Canada Child Benefit. It also includes the Guaranteed Income Supplement. There are many other benefits people could get if they file their taxes every year. The Disability Tax Credit, or DTC for short, is a financial benefit. It can help many people with a disability and their families. This tax credit is about the increased costs that come with having a disability. It can help people reduce the amount of taxes they have to pay. But there are problems with the disability tax credit. Some people with disabilities have even given up trying to apply. The application process is complicated. A doctor or medical professional has to fill out parts of the application. There are fees to have a medical exam. The definition of disability is not a good one. Inclusion Canada wants a better definition of disability to be used. The one used is in the Accessible Canada Act is better. This definition is also in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It should be used in the disability tax credit. There are also other benefits linked to the tax credit. People need to be approved for the tax credit before they can get these. This means they miss out on those benefits. The process to be able to get the DTC needs to be changed. The other benefits linked to the DTC must be available in other ways. A registered disability savings plan, or RDSP for short, is a way for people with disabilities to save money for the long term. People with low income can get federal grants and bonds to add to the savings. But there are a lot of rules and conditions. The program is hard to figure out. Not many people with disabilities are using it. It is possible that they are missing out on many thousands of dollars in benefits. The biggest problem with the disability savings plan is getting money out of it. First, there is a 10-year holdback rule. This means there has to be 10 years between the last time money was put into it and the first time money is taken out of it. Second, there are limits on how much can be taken out of the RDSP. If money is taken out before a person is 60 years old, then there will be plenty to pay. People with disabilities may not get to use their savings when they need them. There needs to be fewer rules about using the disability savings plan. It needs to be easier to use. People with RDSPs should not have to live in poverty until they are 60 years old. Hello, my name is Robert Smith. I was born 15 weeks premature and suffered a grade 3 ventricle bleed. I spent 3 months in hospital in the neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU for short. I finally came home, but on a machine to help me breathe. I slowly improved day by day, but the day arrived when I had an appointment at Sick Kids. At this time, my parents were told I needed a shunt. This happened the next week. I had monthly checkups, received therapy at Northumberland Child Development Center. Over time, my situation improved with weekly visits. I was later tested at Sick Kids, where it was determined that I had 5 different brain injuries: cerebral palsy, or CP for short, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD. I did eventually have to have medication for my ADHD. As I grew, went to school, I struggled all through school. I had to have hearing devices, which led to hearing aids. I managed to graduate and obtain my grade 12 diploma. I have learned as a self-advocate for myself. With my parents' help, I was able to get respite care, passport funding, and ODSP. ODSP benefits I struggled to get by on. It is not enough to support financially to live on my own, pay board, rent, and buy the necessities of life. During my life, I have learned we need a persons with disabilities of any kind. To advocate for ourselves, we need more support financially from ODSP to allow us to live on our own in supported housing and not live below the poverty line. We must be accepted as members in our society, no matter what form of disability we have. I feel very strongly that we need to pressure our government officials to receive more funding. We need more housing support. We need to be included in these decisions, and they need to listen to us. We ask that they listen to us and support us, but we need to keep advocating for ourselves and others. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Good afternoon. My name's Barb McIntyre, and to discuss financial insecurity and how that relates to family, I'll begin by saying that we understand family to consist of two or more people living together or apart, related by blood, marriage, adoption, or a commitment to support one another. Families of people with disabilities are not all the same. Different families have different financial need based on where they live, their family structure, or experience as part of a marginalized group. In Canada, families provide most of the support for their loved ones with an intellectual disability. This support is provided freely out of love and commitment. Parents of children with an intellectual disability have to provide much more support than parents of children without a disability. This expectation continues even when their loved one is an adult. Although adults with disabilities should have access to sufficient support and income to live a life with dignity, this is not usually the reality. Often, one parent stays out of the workforce to meet the support needs of their family member. This has a significant financial impact on families. Families of children with disabilities often live in poverty. Aging parents are typically expected to continue providing support to their adult family member. Being part of a family is key to the inclusion and belonging of people with an intellectual disability. Families provide a loving, nurturing space to learn and grow. As a parent myself, I know the importance of fostering my son's dreams and the means to realize a promising life. Yet, most families often struggle to have their loved ones fully included in community life. As well, raising children with disabilities is more expensive, time-consuming, and lasts longer. This places significant social and financial pressures on families. The extent of this impact is not well documented. Lack of recent data collection focused on children with disabilities and their families has created a significant information gap. In reference to the role of families and the barriers to income support, there are 4 areas I'll talk about: access to the workforce, access to inclusive, affordable childcare, access to financial supports, and saving for the future. Connection to the workforce is key to the financial security of many families. It allows them to meet their current needs and save for the future. For many 2-parent households, this means both adults work outside the home. However, families of children with an intellectual disability experience added barriers to participating in the workforce. In order to accommodate aspects of their child's disability, families I know have been put in the position of working less hours, giving up their careers for lower paying jobs with more flexibility, using all their vacation time for medical appointments or illnesses, and often being overlooked for advancement and growth. I've witnessed families when unable to obtain support for their adult child due to waiting lists, either faced having to quit their job or stay at home with their son or daughter, or leaving their son or daughter at home alone, sometimes unsafely. Other families have been told because they were older, maybe one parent should retire and look after their adult child. I also know of families who, due to inadequate support in the school system, chose to have one parent stay at home to homeschool rather than send their child due to school. Another mom I'm connected to had to quit her job and live on social assistance because the school would call so frequently during the day to come and pick up one of her two children with autism because they couldn't manage them, that she faced being let go. It's really hard to understand how this can happen. Lack of inclusive, affordable childcare prevents single parent and two parent households from fully participating in the workforce. Parents of children with an intellectual disability who are unable to secure childcare must often stay home with their child. This may begin during preschool and extend through to adulthood if inclusive, affordable before and after school childcare is not available. Although recent progress has been made in terms of affordability for families with lower incomes, many are not able to access inclusive care. For families of children 13 and over who continue to require support, a significant gap exists in before and after school care and access to disability supports. I know of a single mom who was working full-time as a paralegal, but could not access inclusive care before and after school for her teen, so she took a part-time job in a school in order to provide that support. The financial security of families is significantly impacted by this limited participation or absence from the workforce. Some families may struggle to meet day-to-day costs of living. This includes added out-of-pocket expenses associated with their child's disability. It's hard to imagine, but over 93% of people providing support to a family member or friend with long-term health condition or disability did not receive any financial support from government programs. Families I'm connected to spend hundreds of dollars every month on medical supplies not covered by plans or programs. I've seen families resort to fundraising to offset some of the cost of vehicles that are chair accessible, as another example of expenses not typical to families without children with disabilities. Extended absences from the workforce also puts the long-term financial security of families in jeopardy, making saving for retirement almost impossible, particularly amongst single-parent households. Even with improved access to the workforce, it's clear that supporting a family member with an intellectual disability comes with added financial costs. When it comes to financial supports, while some tax relief measures and financial programs exist to help offset these costs, they're often difficult to access and limited in what they provide. Unfortunately, we know 91% of those impacted do not receive any federal tax credits. The Child Disability Benefit, or CDB, is a tax-free monthly benefit for families supporting a child aged 18 and under with a disability. To access the CDB, a child must be approved for the Disability Tax Credit, or DTC. As you heard earlier, getting approved for the DTC is often a long and difficult process, and it's sometimes unsuccessful. Families may need support to complete the process. An accountant I know has supported up to 300 families over the years, free of charge, who felt overwhelmed to complete the forms, file eligible transfers, and provide advice. As the gateway to the child disability benefit, registered disability savings plan, and other financial benefits, ensuring access to the disability tax credit is critically important for the financial well-being of people with an intellectual disability and their families. The child disability benefit itself offers important financial support to parents raising a child with a disability. This payment puts money directly in the pockets of families. For some families, provincial or territorial social assistance is their primary source of income. These programs of last resort are not designed to address the financial needs of families raising a child with a disability. Strict eligibility rules, earning restrictions, and household policies mean that families of children with disabilities remain trapped in poverty. Almost 50% of people providing care with a long-term health condition or disability reported they had unmet support needs. Financial support, government assistance, or tax credits are the most common unmet need. When it comes to saving for the future, family members who are absent from the workforce for long periods of time may find it particularly difficult to save for retirement. Parents who stay at home to support their child do not have access to government savings programs like the Canada Pension Plan. Inclusive affordable housing is not available for most adults with intellectual disabilities, so many adults live at home with aging parents. Even when inclusive housing has been secured, often families must continue to financially assist their children at a cost to their own retirement. These parents provide essential support, and their contributions should be recognized and valued. Caring for your child should not mean compromising your future financial security. It's clear that family members who provide support for their loved ones need a solution to save for retirement while continuing to provide this essential support. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Robert, for highlighting some of the concerns that we have around income security for people who have a disability and their families. Taking a lot of that information, the committee came together and created some calls to action. These are federal calls to action. Inclusion Canada advocates federally. This is not an acknowledgement that provincial and territorial programs, support programs, are where we'd like to see them, but this focus is primarily where we can push the federal government and what policies we would like to see federally. So the primary call to action is we'd like to see a Canada Disability Benefit created. The current government has begun sort of teasing that out, and we'd like to see it brought to fruition as soon as possible. This has been going on for a year and a half now, and it's time. So to that end, we've created some things that we'd like to see. The government has really said this would be for working age Canadians. So we assume from that they mean from age 18 to 64. You know, we have some things we'd like to see. We want this to be substantive It has to be meaningful. It has to move people out of poverty in order to make a difference in people's lives. So there's lots of considerations there. There are consultations being undertaken right now around the design of the Canada Disability Benefit, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. But Inclusion Canada has laid out some pretty clear ideas for where we would like to see, the considerations we'd like to see in the design of the Canada Disability Benefit. But that is number one on our goals to accomplish. Just put more money in the hands of people who have a disability. Some other things that we think are really important, Robert talked about it, making it easier to withdraw money from RDSPs. That 10-year rule can be really restrictive, and it is incredibly confusing to work through for people. We'd like to see, this is sort of jumping around the page a little bit, but some work around the disability tax credit, and both Robert and Barb highlighted some concerns and difficulties, barriers that people experience in applying for and getting approved for the disability tax credit. We'd like to see that process made easier. It's expensive, it's cumbersome, it can take a lot of time, and people often feel like they need help navigating that process because quite often they do. So, one consideration we would like on the table is if you've already gone to the process of qualifying for your provincial or territorial disability benefits, then perhaps the federal government could just recognize that standing and qualify you for the disability tax credit. The disability tax credit is important because it is, as Barb mentioned, the gateway to so many things. We'd like to see some of that broken down, separate the RDSP, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, from the disability tax credit. Right now, you must be eligible for the disability tax credit in order to be able to open an RDSP. Again, we'd like to see that separated, find alternative or explore alternative strategies for qualifying people to open an RDSP without having to go through the disability tax credit process. We'd like to see the disability supplement for the Canada Workers Benefit increased. That's a benefit that's given to, so Canada Workers Benefit is given to people who have employment income but are still not making a lot of money. There's a top up for people who have a disability and some different parameters, but we'd like to see that increased. We'd like to really see disincentives for employment removed from disability support programs so that there is better opportunity, less confusion around going out and getting a job. We know that many provincial and territorial benefits are clawed back if a threshold of employment income is earned, and in many places that threshold is much, much too low and can be a disincentive for people to go out and work. This one may seem a little strange, but Robert really talked about it. When we're talking about income security, we're also talking about internet and cell phone access. We deemed internet access to be a necessity, like electricity and running water. This is a different era. And although the federal government has done a lot to help low-income families with young children access lower-cost internet, that single person who's living on a disability, provincial or territorial disability support program, that income's too low quite often for them to afford internet. And we saw during COVID, when libraries and coffee shops were closed, where people would normally access the internet, because it is a necessity, those places closed and people were disconnected from their community. So we need to acknowledge that the internet is a necessity, that there should be low-cost options available, and that cell phone access is part of that. Not everyone on a provincial or territorial disability support program can afford to buy a laptop. So cell phones are a low-cost way to access the internet. We also think there's an possibility that the government increases uptake for the disability tax credit if they make it refundable for low-income Canadians. The benefit is worth about almost $1,700, or the tax credit is worth about $1,700. But if you don't have enough income to offset that, you can often feel like it's not worth the effort to go and apply and go through that restrictive approval process. So for those people who can't, who don't have enough income to take advantage of the full disability tax credit, we're not opposed to having that being a refundable tax credit for those people. We really think gender-based plus analysis, that GBA plus analysis, is incredibly important. The current government has committed to gender-based analysis, so making sure that as they roll out legislation and policy, that the impact on women or gender diverse communities are considered. We'd like to see the disability lens applied to those, that same analysis, so that there is a consideration of how will this policy affect people in Canada who have a disability. And a great example of where that was seen lacking again during COVID with that CERB benefit, $2,000, rolling out to people who lost employment because of COVID, for people who didn't earn enough income in the previous 12 months, for people who just started a job and lost it because things were shut down during COVID. Those people did not receive the CERB benefit. A lot of those people are people who have a disability. So they were shut out of those benefits. And it really took a long time for the government to sort of acknowledge that people with a disability were facing increased costs during COVID, had lost income during COVID. And so we think a disability lens included in that GBA plus analysis would help make sure that policies weren't considerably more punitive to people who have a disability. So and then the last thing we really think could be an advantage, and Robert hit on it a lot, is the tax system in Canada is complicated. Filing taxes is complicated, but there are benefits tied to filing those tax returns. We assume that anything that comes through with the Canada Disability Benefit will also be tied to that filing of tax return. But we'd like to see that the federal government has the ability to see all of the income. If your only source of income is provincial or territorial benefits, the government already knows that. So we'd like to see sort of an auto-filing process for those people with simple tax returns to make sure that they're not missing out on benefits. We know that people are missing out on benefits, so let's make it easier and less cumbersome to navigate the tax system and get those benefits. If you're going to tie benefits to the tax system, let's make it easier. So that's our income security position. And I will say there were a number of other ideas on the table, but when you get to 11, it starts to become difficult to prioritize. So these weren't our only thoughts, but these were the things where we thought we could make the most difference if we could get movement. We also went through and created some income security calls to action for families. Many of these are tied to the income security for people who have a disability. So acknowledging that if we can make things better once you hit the age of 18 and we can get a Canada Disability Benefit in place, that will benefit families as well. But we wanted to look at specifically families with children under the age of 18 that wouldn't be impacted by some of those other calls to actions. So Barb nailed it on the inclusive, affordable childcare. This government has been very clear about rolling out affordable childcare across the country. We stand firm that it must be inclusive. We cannot have our children shut out of affordable childcare simply because it's not on the government's radar. So that goes back to that disability lens being applied. How will this impact other families? So we need affordable childcare to be inclusive. We'd like to see some improvements in the Canada Disability Benefit. So currently that's a benefit if you qualify, if your child qualifies for the disability tax credit, it's a supplement to the Canada Child Benefit. We'd like to see that increased, and we think we'd like to see sort of the renaming piece comes around. We'd like to see that extend a little beyond the age of 18 so that families understanding that at 18, perhaps a child with a disability isn't running out and getting a job. So those costs don't necessarily disappear for families, even though provincial and territorial benefits may begin. So extending that to at least the age of 21, understanding that many people who have a child with an adult child with a disability, that child continues to live at home beyond the age of 18. Again, the disability tax credit, can't stress how important that is, making improvements and making it easier to qualify. Barb talked about a lot about parents coming out of the workforce or parents reducing their employment opportunities to stay home and care for their families. And absolutely, we see that happening. And so a little support, exploring some options for those families who aren't contributing to CPP through regular employment and therefore won't have Canada Pension Plan available in retirement. That income can be substantial, and missing out on it because you've stayed home and stayed out of the workforce, we shouldn't penalize these families for that. We'd like to see a full review of federal government programs that includes things like the RDSP, how it interacts with a registered education savings plan, how people qualify for the disability tax credit, the home buyers plan. There's lots of things that the federal government has brought into programs the federal government has brought into place, and they're acting as standalone items. We'd like to have a thorough review of how these programs are interacting with each other and with other programs that are on the table. A lot of that we are seeing take place now. The federal government is undertaking a disability inclusion action plan, and there are consultations happening around this disability inclusion action plan. DIAP is the short form for that. So the government is looking at 4 key areas. One is income security, where we would see a lot of the work being done around the Canada Disability Benefit. One is accessible spaces. One is employment for people who have a disability. And the last is modernizing the federal government's approach to disability. So that's where we would see things like this review of federal government programs, review of the disability tax credit. So you will probably, if you're paying attention, see some of those consultations roll out over the next month or so. And I would encourage you to give some consideration and some time. Specifically, Inclusion Canada is a lead partner on the financial security piece. We're really excited to be a part of this because we think we have some great ideas around the design of a Canada Disability Benefit, that federal income supplement to people who have a disability. We have thoughts on eligibility, who should qualify, what it means to interact with employment, how it should interact with federal and provincial programs, who you live with. There are all sorts of considerations. And I think Rachel has dropped in the chat a link to some of our thoughts. I don't think she's given you the 11-page policy position that we wrote, but just some key ideas to be thinking about. We are hosting some focus groups here at Inclusion Canada next week. 2 for self-advocates and 1 for families. If we get an overwhelming number of people registering for these, we're trying to keep the numbers low so that we can really get feedback from everybody that we're talking to. You can absolutely email Tisha, let her know which focus group you're interested in. We'll do our best to accommodate, and we'll try and roll out some extras if we do get an increase in the number of people that want to be a part of this. There are also disability organizations all across the country that are doing their own focus groups. That is all part of this process. So it's the same focus group if you attend through Inclusion Canada or if you attend through another organization. So you don't have to worry that you need to get your voice into multiple focus groups. We absolutely will be compiling all of that information together. Additionally, we're hoping to see a survey rolled out. It's still in the works for all 4 of those areas of focus. So it'll be limited questions to make sure that people can manage it, but we're hoping to see that roll out in the next few weeks. Everybody in their area of focus is trying to narrow down their questions to 4 or 5 to not overwhelm everyone. So look for that, share it widely. The more information we can get that is good information around all of the work that the government is doing. Specifically, I care about the income security piece, but I have a bias. The more information we can get and roll up to the government, the better. This really is, they're trying to make it as a very inclusive process. So nothing about us without us is the driving focus. So it's really important that we hear from as many people as possible. And I'm going to turn it back to Rachel.
Thank you, Jill. Huge thank you to all of our speakers today. A lot of really important information there and some really great ideas about how we can get involved. So we have 9 minutes left in our webinar. So we're going to move into our question and answer period. So I would invite folks again to send your questions to us using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or by sending them to forum@inclusioncanada.ca. And we will try and get as many of your questions in as we can. So I think we've got all of our speakers on screen. Fantastic. Okay, so let's start with a question for Robert. So Robert, you said that you've struggled to pay rent and buy the necessities of life. If the government creates the Canada Disability Benefit that Jill has been talking about, what would that mean to you? What would your life look like?
Good question, actually. My life would actually look a lot more better than it is now, struggling to pay for anything of a necessity. And it's about time the government listens, but I mean, who are we kidding? We're trying. And, I mean, we do all this. And to me, if they had the benefit, I'd be able to pay what I wanted. I'd be able to get what I needed, not having to struggle day by day, month by month, year by year to get what I want. So it's a struggle. So I would love to see this benefit come into play, but who knows when that's going to happen.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so we have a question for Barb. So Barb, as a community member, are there things that I can do to support families of children with an intellectual disability who might be experiencing financial insecurity?
Sure. Well, I think Jill gave some great examples in her call to action. And I think supporting the Canada Disability Benefit, if you're in relationship with your MP or member of parliament, say that that is important to you, because what you say matters. I think as a community member, you could notice who's missing from where we are in community, and where our kids are involved in sports clubs or daycares and schools. Invite them in to participate and ask if there's any way to make their participation possible. I think as community members, even in where we work, how we can support families is and individuals in the future is, you know, are we providing flexibilities to our employees, and even are we an inclusive employer? Might be some ways, but I think mainly to be curious and be interested, be an ally and take action.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Barb. So Jill, we'll put the next question to you. So one of the committee's recommendations in the calls to action was to collect more detailed data about children with disabilities and their families. Can you tell us a little bit about why is data so important?
I think data drives everything. I mean, it helps us as an organization in our advocacy if we have accurate information. The government used to do a decent job of collecting data around people who have a disability, their families, what those families look like, income. It is much easier to target a program to benefit people if you have the data to say these are the people we're trying to reach. And we saw it, sort of a good example is around children living in poverty. And this current government has spent a lot of time and effort collecting data and counting those kids who are living in poverty and doing targeting benefits that can help lift those families out of poverty. So we know that if you can see people, you can help people. But when you don't see them, you can't help them. So then you get broader blanket approaches that leave too many gaps. So
That's great. Thank you so much, Jill. So I'm not seeing Robert on screen at the moment. Are you still hearing us, Robert? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to end with one more question to Robert before we go into our closing. So you talked about how people in Ontario on ODSP, or the Ontario Disability Support Program, are living below the poverty line. And we know that this happens in other provinces too. Do you have any ideas about how self-advocates from across Canada can work together to fix this?
Well, right now, with being on Community Living Ontario Council, being a self-advocate myself, we're working on trying to change that. And the biggest thing that we're trying to change, which of course with the next webinar that I've been seeing, is on housing. And that's our one biggest thing. But living below the poverty line is such a struggle. And I mean, for even being on ODSP, it's hard. Like, I'm only getting a fair amount at the end of the month on top of having a job and working, and the earned income that I earn, it affects me more. So if I earn more than what I make at working, that takes off my ODSP check. So it really is a struggle. Now, fixing it, I'm hoping we can fix it, but who knows? We just have to hope and pray and try that we can fix it. But I mean, it's going to take time. And living below the poverty line is just something that I hate seeing on anybody to this day. I really hate it.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so that is our time for today. So I want to thank again our panelists. I would like to thank our accessibility providers. And I would to remind everybody that we do have one more session coming up in this webinar series. So on June 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll be exploring Inclusion Canada's positions on housing. We hope that you will take a few minutes after today's webinar to fill out a feedback form about today's event to help us improve future webinars. The link to this feedback form is in the chat, and it will be sent to you by email as well. So again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in June.